Hi, this is Dr. Steve Thompson, and this is your Criminal Justice Ethics. This is your Chapter 6 lecture. This is going to be on the purpose of criminal punishment. So once a person is convicted, now this is a punishment can be administered in the process of arrest, in the process of the initial incarceration, but technically punishment is not allowed until there is a conviction, and then the punishment is in the form of, basically limited means, such as the lowest form of punishment would be a fine, and the highest form of punishment allowed in the USA is going to be the death penalty. So any other punishment outside of within those lines, a fine, incarceration, probation, parole, community service, so forth, is the only punishments available by law. No one can be physically punished other than the sole and only punishment of actually killing someone. So strapping them to a chair and placing a needle in their arm and injecting them with a fatal substance, or a substance that would cause a fatality. There is no allowable, spankings, beatings, or anything like that allowed in our criminal justice system. So any administration of punishment outside of these measures is illegal, including if someone, we'll say they deserve it. Someone who resists arrest, now an officer might use force on that person, or let's say a man goes up and punches a police officer when he attempts to place him under arrest. The officer's going to punch him back, probably hit him with a stick, taser, so forth. That's not considered punishment. That is considered a reasonable level of force to effect an arrest. Again, punishment is not physical punishment is not allowed. So moving on, but this chapter is limited to the punishment after a person has been convicted. So pretrial confinement, like I said, would be, some people would look at that as punishment, and it is. It's not considered punishment as it pertains to this chapter. And we're considered innocent till proven guilty. So any punishment administered prior to a conviction is actually not acceptable. But putting somebody in jail and requiring them to bond out, or even keeping them in jail to prevent them from committing future crimes, is not considered punishment. It's just an allowable, an accepted practice, legal practice within our criminal justice system. So theoretical approaches to punishment, we catch somebody doing something, they deserve to be punished. And from a formalist view, it's a formalist view is, doing it the right way. A lot of formalists would look at that as an acceptable practice. A utilitarianist might look at it differently. For instance, if you put somebody like we'll bring up the drug war. I'll talk about the drug war a lot. If you put somebody in jail for possession or even sale of an illegal drug for 10 years, and we do that a lot. It's very common. People do decades in prison for being drug dealers. When they get out, they go right back to it. They're a convicted felon. They know the drug trade, and it's worth the risk. So not only do they go right back to it, when they go inside, somebody steps into their place. So the effectiveness of the punishment should be to stop people from doing it. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we go on in this chapter. Stop people from doing it, serving as a specific deterrence, because it's kind of hard to be a drug dealer, not impossible. Hard to be a drug dealer when you're incarcerated in a correctional facility. And then the general deterrent is going to be, if I see my next door neighbor go to prison for being a drug dealer, I'm going to be less likely to be a drug dealer, because I don't want to go to prison just like he did. Or you never know, I might just decide, hey, since he went to prison, I'll take all his customers and start selling whatever drug he was selling. So moving on, we talked about, and I'm going through the chapter 6 slides, so I'm on slide 3 now, but utilitarian theories, we set the goal of punishment as a prevention of future crime. So it's going to be your goal is deterrence, and retribution is to make sure that the offender gets punished. So punishment retribution as a goal, because society may look at retribution as in payback. You gotta suffer for what you did, as a positive outcome. And if you look at it as a future goal, or you want to improve the future, that retribution might not be ineffective. But the punishment itself, some people would look at that, and including myself, I'll express my opinion. I won't say it's right all the time, but including myself, I would say that people just need retribution, and it might make me feel good to see someone get what they deserve. You steal an old lady Social Security check and she starved for 2 months. That's a white collar crime, and usually when somebody gets caught committing white collar crime or just blatant theft, usually when somebody gets caught doing that, they do a little bit of jail time or whatever. But I want that person to really learn a lesson. I want them to suffer like the person that they made suffer, who they made starve for months or whatever. So, the societal objective or even opinion on it is, it's something we have to take into consideration because we are a democratic society. We get to vote. Our politicians pretty much should do what we desire of them, and that's one of the things. That's why we live in a society with a criminal justice system that considers retribution as, I would say, even the primary objective. Which the primary objective, some would argue, including myself, should be, even though I'm speaking against what I just said, should be to improve our future. And improving our future means if retribution doesn't work, we should try something else. So, we'll get into rehabilitation and restoration in the future. This is going to be a quick chapter, so we're buzzing through this pretty good. But I've already talked about deterrence. So, if it works, let's do it. For instance, arresting a child molester and putting that person in prison. That is a great deterrence because a person in a prison can't molest a child. So that person's not only deterred, but also incapacitated. And when that person gets out, they should be thinking, well, I don't want to go to prison, and I don't think they should be let out, period, but they do get let out. There's a common misconception out there about the statistics involving sex offenders. A lot of people say, well, when they get out, they usually get rearrested, and they commit more and more crimes. But the recidivism rate for sex offenders is actually some of the lowest. So capturing and arresting them, which usually includes prior to release, they have to complete treatment to make sex offender treatment to hopefully teach them not to do it again, because if they're going to be released, they should receive some type of treatment. Again, I don't think they should be released at all, but that's just my opinion. But anyway, the recidivism rates are actually very low for that particular type of offense. Drug offenses are very high. People get out and go right back to using drugs, but I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but a very low percentage of people released after being convicted of a sex crime don't go back and get rearrested for committing a sex crime. That could be because they're not doing it. It also could be because they're not getting caught doing it. Again, we're just analyzing the statistics, and they're limited to arrest data and stuff like that. If a victim doesn't report it, we wouldn't know. Just something to think about. We talked about individual and general deterrence, so I'll move on from that. When we look at we'll say somebody in jail has an effectiveness, like a shelf life. So if you catch somebody stealing a candy bar and you put them in jail for 30 years, it has an effectiveness, and we can study each type of crime. I just want us to think about, 30 years in jail for a candy bar is a really long time. We'll call that just a bit excessive. But if the research, and we have to look at it as criminologists, the research, if the research says 3 days in jail gives us the maximum level of effectiveness as far as deterring this person from committing a future theft, then that's where we need to be on incarceration. It shouldn't be based on emotion or feeling. We have to look at it from a macro level to say, what's the best bang for our buck. And some crimes, it may even be better not to incarcerate at all, depending on the circumstances. I don't want to get into too much into criminological theory, but there is the theory that if you put somebody in through the formal system, they succumb to a self-fulfilling prophecy. And not only that, they're formally processed, so those are records that can be retrieved from employers and stuff like that. They got to check the box that says, yeah, I've been arrested, I've been convicted, I've been officially processed by these things, and that can affect somebody for the rest of their life. In fact, if you see and this is, we'll call it stereotyping or whatever, but if you see someone out picking up scrap metal, that's about the only job that a lot of sex offenders can obtain, because they walk in and they say, well, are you a registered sex offender? Have you been convicted of a felony? And once they say yes, nobody will touch them. So, they might turn to other types of crime. They might but there's really their life is over essentially once they receive that stigmatization of a registered as a sex offender. And I'm not defending. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying, we have to look at each crime on what works as far as punishment. And if it's theft, if it's rape, if it's drug dealing, if it's possession, so forth, such as possession, we tried putting people in jail to get them off of drugs. We've been doing that for, half a century. It hasn't worked. So we definitely need to stop that. And, but there is statistical research says that if you put a drug abuser in treatment, it is much more effective than a jail cell. And a lot of people say, no. You can't help somebody who doesn't want to help themselves. You can't force treatment on somebody that doesn't want it. They have to want it, and then it'll work. Well, I'm sorry, but the statistics say you are wrong, and I was wrong. I thought the same thing. No, you gotta want it, but that's not the case. You take somebody who's on drugs, they don't want to be on drugs, but they also don't want to go to treatment. They're just going to seek their drug addiction and keep using drugs until something gets in their way and gets them off of it. And drug treatment versus a jail cell is much more effective. And by the way, it's astronomically cheaper to go to drug treatment versus incarceration. So just something to think about. We've talked about retribution. So, getting that payback. And when I see somebody hit somebody for no reason, I really want that person to be hit as well. So that's kind of our retribution. You steal something from somebody, I want you to go to jail. I want you to have to pay for it. You steal somebody's $20,000 car, and then you sell it to a chop shop for $3,000, and it's gone forever. You got $3,000. Okay, we caught you, and maybe you still have the $3,000. Probably not, but I want you to have to pay that person back the full $20,000, the full value of the vehicle, which would be a significant hit on you if you have to work for the next 2 years or 3 years or however long it takes to pay back that money when and it's a loss for you. I want to see that retribution. Also known, if you're paying back the victim, that's going to be also known as restoration. You restore the victim to their original state by paying for their car, getting them a car back. Restoration is a concept that's relatively new, and we've been saying it's new for about 15 or 20 years. So I guess it's at this point it's pretty old. But the focus of not only rehabilitation but restoration, you put all that together, especially when you have a victim. When you have a victim who's been, when I say a victim who's been hurt, we'll say a rape victim or the parents of a murder victim, which usually murders, usually they don't get out, but sometimes they do. But there's been TV shows and stuff about putting the murderer and so forth in contact with a victim. The research really it's kind of limited on that because it's a very rare event. But the concept of restoration, especially when it comes to, we'll say, returning property, that definitely puts the victim back to where they were in a good position. Restorative justice is and should be a part of the, of the motivation for our punishment system. If seeing an offender go to prison for the rest of their lives for a rape makes the victim feel safe and feel better, period, knowing that person can't rape anybody else and can never walk around again, that's, in my opinion, some type of restorative justice, rehabilitation, just desserts, payback, whatever you want to call it. It's definitely a good thing, especially when you have a crime of violence. But most offenders are actually going to be released from the prison system at some point. Most of them actually don't go to prison. They pay a fine, they get on probation, they watch them, or they're supposed to watch them. When you got a probation parole agent with 250 people on his caseload, there's not much supervision going on there. So, it's a combination of what works. Also, we have to take into consideration the political environment we live in. For instance, the research on sex offender registration shows that it has absolutely no impact on improving or protecting victims. It just doesn't. But it makes us feel good. I succumb to it as well. If someone moves in next door to me that is a registered sex offender, I want to know about it, and I'm going to treat that person differently. I'm not going to allow my children around them. I'm going to point a camera at their house from mine, or I'm just going to, hopefully limit them from even living, where we live, because I don't want that. And I have dealt with that before personally. A sex offender moved in next door to me before by fraudulent means, and once I found out that the sex offender moved in based on having the elderly landlord sign a form that they thought was for something different, they tricked them into signing the sex offender allowing them to live there form. And once I found out about that and found out about the fraud, I made sure that person could no longer live there. So I know the statistics don't support SOR, but it makes me feel good. It's not going away, and it's going to stay there. So I'm being a hypocrite is what I'm getting at. We can look at things, from a mathematical perspective on what works and so forth, but once you apply that to reality, it's not always the case. So we have to look at, from an ethical standpoint, a virtuous person would look at each situation specifically and individually and make a decision on what the best punishment or lack thereof was going to be. A formalist would apply ethical punishment in accordance with the law, and a utilitarianist would do whatever it takes to make the outcome better. And so we'll say a virtuous person is able to put utility and formalism together to make the best possible decision. All right, we'll see you guys in chapter 7.